Chosen ones, they laughed at you, not because you were wrong, but because you saw too much. Because you felt too deeply. Because you dared to speak the things others were too afraid to even think. You were labeled the outsider, the eccentric, the dreamer with eyes that couldn't seem to stay grounded in reality. But what is reality to those who live inside illusion? They scoffed when you spoke of the shift, rolled their eyes when you warned them of what was to come. You tried to explain. You tried to prepare them. But they weren't listening. They didn't want to listen. Because to acknowledge your words would mean confronting a world that terrified them. So they mocked instead. It was easier that way. Safer. Dismissal is a comfortable form of denial, after all. You're crazy, they said, smiling with superiority, unaware that the very foundation they stood on was beginning to shake. To them, you were delusional. Your truth was a threat. Your clarity, an offense. They whispered behind your back, laughed in your face, and carried on with their routines while you carried the burden of knowing. You spoke with conviction, because what you saw, what you felt, burned too fiercely inside to be silenced. You weren't trying to impress. You weren't seeking attention. You were simply trying to honor the truth planted within your soul. And that made you dangerous. Because in a world built on deception, nothing is more threatening than someone who sees clearly. Someone who refuses to play along. You weren't lost. You were awake. And in a society addicted to illusion, that made you the enemy. But even as the laughter rang out and the judgment echoed, you stood. You stumbled, yes. You questioned yourself, of course. But deep down, there was always a stillness, a knowing that could not be reasoned away. And now, the moment you always sensed has arrived. One by one, the pieces are falling into place. The warnings you gave, the signs you saw, the patterns you tracked, they're all coming to life before their very eyes. And suddenly, they're not laughing anymore. The silence is almost deafening. The same voices that once called you crazy now speak in hushed tones. The same eyes that once looked through you now look at you, with uncertainty, with fear, with the haunting realization that maybe, just maybe, you were never crazy after all. Maybe you were something else entirely. Maybe you were chosen. This moment, it doesn't feel triumphant. Not in the way you might have once imagined. There is no parade. No applause. Only the heavy weight of truth finally rising to the surface. You don't feel the urge to say, "I told you so." You feel the urge to exhale. To breathe. To stand still and let the quiet validate what words never could. Because this was never about being right. This was about carrying a burden you never asked for but could not abandon. This was about obedience, to the voice within, to the divine nudges, to the mission that wouldn't let you go. You were called before you had language for it. You saw things before you understood them. You felt different, not because you were broken, but because you were being set apart. And they couldn't see it. They wouldn't see it. How could they? They were still asleep. Dreaming within the dream. Protecting their fragile sense of normal with all they had. So of course they laughed. Of course they denied. Of course they fought against what they could not comprehend. It was never really about you. It was about the truth you carried, and the way it made them uncomfortable. But now, reality is knocking. Loud. Unignorable. Undeniable. The things you warned them about are not just possibilities anymore. They are here. They are happening. And the irony is, they remember what you said. They remember your words. They remember your tone. And they're wondering, how did they know? They won't say it out loud. Pride still stands in the way. But you see it in their eyes. You hear it in their silence. You feel it in the strange shift in how they treat you now, less mocking, more cautious. Because deep down, something in them knows that you weren't guessing. You were guided. Think back. Remember all the times you questioned your own sanity. When the weight of being misunderstood felt unbearable. When you begged God for release from the burden of knowing. When you tried to be normal for their sake, but it never quite worked. The noise of the world never drowned out the signal in your soul. And now, you know why. You weren't meant to blend in. You were meant to see. You were given sight not to impress the blind, but to prepare the way. You were given ears to hear what others dismissed as noise. You were given a heart tuned to divine frequency in a world playing static. And that's why they hated you. That's why they feared you. Because you didn't just speak truth, you embodied it. And truth, when it walks into the room, shakes every illusion to its core. So now, what do you do? As the world begins to realign around the very things you once spoke of, how do you respond? You stand. Not in bitterness, but in clarity. Not with vengeance, but with purpose. You do not chase them. You do not explain. You do not look back, hoping they'll finally see. Because the time for persuasion has passed. This is not about them anymore. This is about you stepping into the fullness of what you were always meant to be. Not crazy. Not delusional. Called. Chosen. Set apart. They called you a lunatic. But your so-called crazy talk is now echoing in the headlines, manifesting in events, playing out in ways they can no longer rationalize. And you? You are not surprised. This isn't new to you. It's confirmation. You saw it coming, not because you're better, but because you were listening. To God. To Spirit. To the signs. To the whisper that said, speak. And now, your voice rings louder than ever, not because you've raised it, but because time has caught up with your truth. You don't need to prove anything anymore. You don't need their apology. You don't need their validation. The silence is enough. The shift is enough. The unfolding is enough. Let them wrestle with what they ignored. Let them make peace with what they mocked. That is their journey now. Yours is ahead, deeper, higher, more purposeful than ever. Because when God marks someone as chosen, the world may not understand them, but heaven does. And heaven does not apologize for placing fire in your bones. Heaven does not second-guess itself when it gives you a voice. You are not here by mistake. You are not broken. You are not lost. You are aligned. And in the quiet aftermath of their laughter, the truth stands tall, with you right beside it. Unshaken. Unapologetic. Unstoppable. You were never just talking. You were prophesying. You were never just dreaming. You were remembering. You were never lost in fantasy. You were living the reality of heaven before it touched earth. And now that it's here, they see it. Maybe too late. Maybe still resisting. But they see it. And whether they accept it or not doesn't matter anymore. The truth doesn't need a crowd. It just needs one voice brave enough to carry it. That voice was yours. And now, that truth is walking in broad daylight. No more hiding. No more whispering. It is here. And so are you. You are not crazy. You are called. And the moment they laughed at has become the moment you rise. You didn't imagine it. You didn't fabricate it. You didn't lose your mind or wander too far from the crowd. What you carry inside of you is not a mistake, it is a divine assignment. That knowing, that deep, unshakable certainty you feel in your spirit, it was placed there for a reason. Long before you had words to explain it, long before anyone tried to silence it, it was already there, growing, glowing, waiting for its appointed time. And when it finally began to stir, when it began to speak in dreams, signs, intuition, and sacred whispers, you didn't run. You listened. They called it delusion because it didn't fit inside their frame of logic. They mocked your vision because it didn't match the limits of their sight. But that's the very essence of the call, to see what others cannot, to carry what others are not meant to bear. You weren't just sensing something random. You were receiving divine instruction. You weren't chasing fantasy, you were responding to prophecy. And no matter how loud the world got, no matter how many times they rolled their eyes or called you dramatic or paranoid, you could still feel it pulsing in your bones. That deep-rooted knowledge. That unshakable conviction. That sacred knowing that refuses to be dismissed. It's not arrogance. It's not pride. It's presence, God's presence, resting upon your life in a way they cannot comprehend. Because while they were chasing after trends, distractions, and illusions of comfort, you were being pulled by something different. Something higher. You weren't seeking applause or popularity. You were seeking truth. And truth doesn't entertain. It transforms. That's why it hurts. That's why it isolates. That's why those who carry it are often pushed to the edge of society, misunderstood, mislabeled, and rejected. Because truth unsettles the comfortable. It breaks down false systems. It reveals cracks in the foundation. And you were never meant to blend into what's crumbling. You were born to see it coming. This gift inside you, it's not for show. It's not for ego. It's not even for explanation. It's a torch. A light in the fog. A divine signal that calls you to move differently, speak differently, think differently. You've always felt it. Even when you tried to ignore it. Even when you tried to go back to normal. Normal never fit you. The rhythm of the world never felt right under your feet. That's because you weren't called to move with the world. You were called to interrupt it. The weight you feel is real. The urgency is real. The visions, the dreams, the patterns you pick up, the way your spirit tightens when something feels off, it's not anxiety, it's alignment. You were designed to detect what others can't. You were built to perceive shifts that others dismiss. That is not a mental illness. That is not a flaw. That is a sign. A spiritual alert system given only to those who are meant to see ahead. And you are one of those rare few. That's why you couldn't ignore the signs. That's why you couldn't unsee what was revealed. The world told you to be quiet, but your spirit burned louder. They told you to calm down, but your soul surged with urgency. You tried to silence it. You tried to pretend you didn't feel it. But the call of the chosen doesn't shrink when ignored, it grows. It presses in. It keeps showing up in numbers, faces, repeated dreams, divine interruptions. That is how heaven speaks when it has something urgent to say. And heaven chose you to hear it. Don't let their mockery confuse you. Don't let their unbelief weaken your resolve. What you carry is real. Your knowing is not rooted in ego, it's rooted in revelation. While they cling to temporary comforts, you're being prepared for eternal truth. And not everyone will see it. Not everyone is meant to. That's what makes your journey sacred. Because while the masses chase noise, you have learned to trust the whisper. Not everyone gets this kind of vision. Not everyone feels the pull. It's not distributed to the crowd. It's given to the called. And those who are called are always misunderstood, always stretched, always made to feel like strangers in a world they no longer recognize. But you're not crazy. You're not lost. You're not broken. You're set apart. And yes, being set apart means being misunderstood. It means long nights of doubt. It means walking alone while others celebrate illusion. But you must understand this, solitude is not punishment. It is preparation. You were never excluded. You were selected. And there's a difference. The pain you feel is not the sting of rejection. It is the friction of divine alignment. The ache you carry is not because you missed something, it's because you've been marked for something greater. You are not an outcast. You are a forerunner. A pathbreaker. A torchbearer sent to walk through the darkness long before others are willing to admit that the lights are going out. So no, you're not imagining it. The pressure, the patterns, the shift in the air, it's all real. You've been given eyes to see what most overlook. And while others mock the storm siren, you are already building the ark. They call it foolishness. You know it as faith. They call it paranoia. You recognize it as prophecy. You have nothing to prove. You are not here to convince them. You are here to carry the message. And that message is not yours, it's heaven's. They won't understand why you walk away from certain crowds. Why you reject shallow distractions. Why you seem different or distant. But that's because they don't feel what you feel. They haven't been called to the weight you carry. They haven't been awakened to the reality that keeps you up at night. Don't let their ignorance become your shame. You don't owe the crowd your comfort. You owe God your obedience. And the truth is, obedience will cost you. It will cost you approval. It will cost you belonging. It will cost you easy answers and convenient living. But what you gain in return is clarity, strength, authority, peace that isn't dependent on circumstance, and a vision that cannot be bought or broken. You were never meant to follow the masses. You were meant to stand apart. You were meant to see beyond the surface. You were meant to walk with heaven's instruction in your spirit while the rest of the world walks in circles. That's why it feels like you're not from here. Because, in many ways, you're not. Your spirit was designed for another kingdom. One that is not built by human hands. One that operates on faith, not fear. One that moves with purpose, not panic. So let the world call it madness. Let them dismiss your knowing. Let them label what they cannot understand. You are not here to win their approval. You are here to fulfill your assignment. And that assignment, though lonely, though painful, though misunderstood, is sacred. The same God who gave you the vision will give you the strength to carry it. The same God who called you apart will surround you with angels when the noise gets loud. You are not alone. You are not lost. You are not delusional. You are chosen. Set apart. Marked. And no amount of rejection can erase what heaven has written over your life. So stand tall. Speak truth. Walk in obedience, even when the path is narrow and steep. Because this is not an illusion. This is your calling. This is your mission. This is your confirmation. You are walking exactly where you were meant to walk, at exactly the time you were meant to rise. And when they come back, confused, unsure, trying to understand how you knew, don't seek revenge. Don't demand validation. Just stand. Quietly. Confidently. Unshaken. Because those who are truly chosen don't need to be believed to be blessed. They simply walk with the blessing, and eventually, the world catches up. They didn't believe you. They rolled their eyes. They called you crazy. They whispered behind your back, smirked when you spoke, and distanced themselves the moment your truth made them uncomfortable. To them, your visions were madness. Your warnings. Paranoia. Your dreams. Delusions. But here's the truth they didn't want to hear: this has happened before. Over and over again. Since the very beginning of time, those chosen by God have carried messages the world wasn't ready for. And every single time, they were mocked, until they were proven right. You're not the first. You won't be the last. You're part of a divine pattern. And that pattern is older than you know. It is written in the sacred pages of Scripture and etched into the very fabric of spiritual history. It goes like this: first comes the ridicule, then comes the revelation. First comes rejection, then comes realization. First, they laugh, then, they listen. Let's begin where it always begins, with Noah. A man who heard the voice of God in a world that had stopped listening. Imagine building a giant ark in the middle of dry land. Imagine spending years, decades, constructing something nobody had ever seen for a disaster nobody believed in. The people laughed. They scoffed. They called him a lunatic. The skies were blue. The land was dry. And this man dared to speak of rain. Of floods. Of judgment. He was mocked without mercy. But the day the rain began to fall, the laughter stopped. Suddenly, Noah's madness became wisdom. His obedience became salvation. And those who had laughed were now pounding on the very doors they once ridiculed. But it was too late. Matthew 24 verses 38 to 39. Then there was Joseph. A young man with divine dreams, given to him by God himself. But when he shared his dreams, visions of leadership, of power, of divine positioning, he wasn't celebrated. He was hated. Hated by his own brothers. Betrayed. Sold. Silenced. Why? Because people fear what they don't understand, and envy what they don't believe they can have. But Joseph held on. He held on through slavery, through prison, through the betrayal of those closest to him. And in time, the dream they mocked became the reality they had to bow to. He saved the very ones who sold him. He fed the mouths that once cursed his name. And in that moment, Joseph wasn't just a dreamer, he was a deliverer. Genesis 50 verse 20. Then we have Jeremiah. The weeping prophet. A man burdened with divine revelation so heavy it brought him to tears. He cried not because he was weak, but because he could see what others refused to. He warned of destruction. Called for repentance. Pleaded with the people to turn back to God. But they didn't want truth. They wanted comfort. So they labeled him negative. Too intense. Too extreme. They beat him. Imprisoned him. Silenced him. But Jeremiah couldn't stop. He wasn't speaking from his flesh, he was echoing heaven. And when destruction came, just as he said it would, those who mocked him had to face the truth, he was right. The pain he endured became proof of the truth he carried. Jeremiah 20 verses 7 to 8. And then, the ultimate example, Jesus. The Messiah. The Son of God. Love incarnate. He healed the sick, raised the dead, forgave sins, and preached a kingdom not of this world. And yet, they called him crazy. They said he was demon-possessed. In John 10 verse 20, they said, "He is mad. Why listen to him?" They didn't understand that when heaven speaks through flesh, the world will always call it madness. So they beat him. Spit on him. Nailed him to a tree. They mocked him as he died. But 3 days later, the tomb was empty. The cross wasn't the end, it was the door. And the resurrection was heaven's final word, he was telling the truth all along. So what about you? If you've been mocked, good. If you've been misunderstood, good. If people have called you crazy for the things you felt in your spirit, good. Because that's the pattern. You are walking the same path the prophets walked. The same road the apostles endured. The same fire that shaped the saints is now shaping you. And while they laugh now, while they dismiss you today, the time will come, soon, when the very things you saw, said, and sensed will unfold before their eyes. History is not random. It repeats for a reason. The Bible doesn't just recount events, it reveals divine templates. God shows us the pattern so that when it begins to repeat, we will recognize it. And right now, that pattern is echoing through your life. You are not being singled out by accident. You are being set apart by design. This is spiritual history repeating itself through you. You see, people only believe what they can measure, explain, or control. And what they can't understand, they ridicule. They laughed at the ark because they had never seen rain. They mocked Joseph because he was a slave with a dream. They silenced Jeremiah because his truth made them uncomfortable. They crucified Jesus because his holiness exposed their hypocrisy. And now, they mock you because your calling stirs something in them they aren't ready to face. Don't be discouraged by their rejection. Rejoice in it. It is evidence that your spirit is aligned with something bigger than this world. It means you're moving with heaven's rhythm, not earth's approval. Because if the world fully understood you, you wouldn't be chosen. You'd be comfortable. But the chosen ones are never comfortable, they are called, stretched, isolated, and then revealed. Even now, as people scoff, roll their eyes, or walk away from you, the truth within you is ripening. Quietly. Steadily. And one day, when the storms begin, when the truth breaks open like thunder, when the systems they trusted begin to fall, they will remember what you said. They will remember who stood alone. They will remember the one they called crazy. And their silence will say what their pride never could, you were right. And in that moment, you won't need revenge. You won't need validation. You'll simply stand, just like Noah, Joseph, Jeremiah, and Jesus, and let the fulfillment speak for itself. Because divine truth doesn't need to shout when it finally arrives. It just is. So what do you do now? You keep speaking. You keep seeing. You keep believing. Even if your voice trembles. Even if your hands shake. Even if no one claps when you finish. Because heaven is listening, even when earth isn't. And angels are standing at attention, even when people walk away. You were never meant to be understood by everyone. You were meant to be obedient to one. And if you ever forget why the road feels so lonely, remember this, the ones who carry truth walk ahead of the crowd, not behind it. And when you walk ahead, they can't see what you see. So they mock what they don't understand. But soon, they will. The ones who mocked Noah wished they had listened when the rain fell. The ones who betrayed Joseph had to bow when famine came. The ones who silenced Jeremiah felt the fire he warned them about. And the ones who crucified Jesus couldn't deny the glory of an empty tomb. The cycle continues. And now, you are part of it. So hold your ground, chosen one. Keep building. Keep dreaming. Keep warning. Keep walking. The pattern is ancient. The ridicule is temporary. But the vindication? Eternal. You're not crazy. You're not alone. You're not lost. You are a living prophecy, walking proof that heaven speaks and history always repeats. There comes a time in the journey of every chosen one when the echo of mockery fades into a silence so thick, so telling, it feels like prophecy unfolding in real time. It is a moment you've prayed for, but never demanded. A moment you hoped would come, but never chased. It arrives not with a crowd celebrating your name, but with quiet eyes that can no longer deny what they once dismissed. In this moment, there are no more debates. No more sarcastic laughs. No more side glances or whispered jokes behind your back. There is just silence, and within that silence, the sound of truth standing tall. You remember how they looked at you when you spoke. Like you were strange. Like you were broken. Like you were reaching for something that didn't exist. They didn't see the vision. They didn't hear what you heard. They didn't feel what burned inside your bones every time God whispered something too holy for words. And because they couldn't feel it, they chose to mock it. Because they couldn't explain it, they chose to ridicule it. It was easier to label you as crazy than to admit they were spiritually blind. And so they laughed. They laughed when you said you sensed a shift coming. They laughed when you told them you had dreams of warning. They laughed when you wept over what was to come, while they partied under skies they thought would never change. They labeled you a drama maker, a doomsayer, a misfit. But deep inside, you weren't speaking from fear, you were speaking from a place of knowing. A place that didn't come from intellect, but from intimacy with God. You weren't trying to be dramatic. You were trying to prepare them. But they couldn't hear you. And so they cast you aside. Now, the skies have shifted. The very things you warned them about are unfolding. The dreams you once journaled in silence are beginning to take shape in real time. The spiritual tremors you felt in your spirit have become earthquakes that shake the foundations of their false security. And suddenly, the laughter has stopped. The boldness of their dismissal has turned into hesitation. They can't say you were wrong, because the evidence is too clear. So instead, they say nothing. Silence. And not the peaceful kind. This silence is loaded with guilt, regret, and the realization that they dismissed the voice of God simply because it came from someone they underestimated. They didn't just laugh at you, they laughed at the one who sent you. And now they don't know what to say. So they say nothing. This moment is not about revenge. It's not about proving your enemies wrong. It's not about rubbing anything in their faces. This is a holy moment. A moment when heaven confirms what earth refused to see. And you, chosen one, you are standing in the glow of divine confirmation. You don't have to say, "I told you so." You don't have to remind them of how they treated you. Your consistency is your testimony. Your endurance is your vindication. Your silence in the face of their silence is more powerful than any rebuke. But you will notice something strange in this season. Some of the very people who laughed at you will begin to inch their way back into your life. They won't apologize. They'll pretend like the past never happened. They'll ask you for insight, for guidance, for prayer. They'll say things like, "You've always had such a deep spirit," conveniently forgetting how they mocked that same spirit months or years ago. Some will go further. They'll try to attach themselves to your rising. They'll spin new stories, revise the past, and act like they were always supportive, because the truth makes them uncomfortable. Your light reveals their pride. Your faith reveals their fear. Your rise reveals their resistance to the truth. And so they do what people have always done, try to rewrite the story in their favor. But here's the key, you don't owe them your silence, and you don't owe them your attention. You don't need to explain where you've been. You don't need to justify why you kept moving when they tried to stop you. You don't need to give them front row access to a show they never believed would happen. Because this stage of your life, this elevation, this promotion, this manifestation, it wasn't built by their applause. It was built by your obedience. It was carved in the midnight hours when no one was watching. It was forged in fire, in isolation, in the refining furnace of ridicule. This is not their reward. This is God's reward to you. And that's why it feels so sacred. Because you know what it cost you to get here. You remember the nights when you questioned your own sanity. When the silence of God felt louder than the mockery of man. When you looked at the vision and wondered, did I get it wrong? But every time you got close to giving up, something inside you burned. Something pulled you back to your knees. Something reminded you that you weren't imagining this, that what you carried was holy. And now, that very thing you protected in secret is beginning to speak in public. It's undeniable. And those who once mocked you now have no choice but to sit in the quiet tension of being wrong. But here's where you must rise above. Because when you've been mocked and then vindicated, it's tempting to let the pain speak. It's tempting to use the truth as a weapon. To throw the proof in their faces. But don't. That's not who you are. That's not who God called you to be. You were not chosen to gloat, you were chosen to guide. You were not elevated to dominate, you were elevated to illuminate. Let the silence of your enemies become the platform for your humility. Let your rise be marked by reverence, not revenge. Because if you stay humble now, God will raise you even higher. Just like Joseph. When his brothers came back, years after selling him into slavery, he could have exposed them. He could have told Pharaoh what they did. He could have crushed them with a word. But he didn't. He wept. He forgave. And he blessed the very ones who tried to bury him. Why? Because Joseph understood that his journey wasn't about the betrayal, it was about the purpose. And you must understand the same. God didn't allow you to be mocked just for the sake of suffering. He allowed it so that when he lifted you up, no one could take credit but him. He allowed it so that when others see you now, they'll say, "Surely, the hand of God is upon them." So stand tall. You don't have to speak loudly, your life is already speaking. You don't have to prove yourself, your fruit is proving everything. You don't have to retaliate, your rise is more powerful than any revenge. And when people ask how it happened, point them to God. Not to your talent. Not to your hustle. Not to your wisdom. To God. Because that's how the story will change lives. That's how your journey becomes a testimony. That's how your pain becomes purpose. There's a holy silence falling on your life right now. Can you feel it? It's not the silence of abandonment, it's the silence of recognition. They see you now. Even if they don't say it. They know the truth now. Even if they pretend not to. But you don't need them to say it. Because heaven has already declared it. You were chosen. You were right. You were faithful. And now, you're rising. Let the silence of those who doubted you be the background music to your ascension. Let it remind you of how far you've come, not to gloat, but to give glory. Not to look down on them, but to lift up your eyes to the one who never left your side. Because this is not the end of your story. This is the beginning of a new chapter. One where you walk not as the mocked, but as the confirmed. Not as the doubted, but as the delivered. Not as the forgotten, but as the favored. Walk in that truth. Speak when God tells you to speak. Be silent when He says be still. Move only by His instruction. Because this is holy ground now. And the same voices that tried to break you, will soon be the ones whispering your name in reverence. Let them whisper. Let them wonder. Let them watch. Because they'll never be able to explain how someone they tried to destroy is now walking in divine favor. But we know the secret, don't we? You were never crazy. You were never lost. You were never alone. You were chosen. There comes a moment in the journey of every chosen one when they begin to question everything, not because they doubt God, but because the world has made them doubt themselves. The weight of being different, the pain of being mocked, the loneliness of walking alone, it all begins to press in like waves crashing against the edge of an ancient lighthouse. But what that lighthouse does not forget, and what you must not forget, is that it was never built to blend into the shoreline. It was built to stand out. It was built to shine. You, chosen one, are that lighthouse. You were not called to comfort the crowd. You were called to be a beacon in a storm no one else even knows is coming. And yes, for that, they called you crazy. They called you unstable. They said you were overthinking, too spiritual, too sensitive, too much. But if you were just like them, how could you carry a vision that is not from this world? You weren't meant to speak what's already accepted. You were meant to speak what's coming. And for that reason alone, they misunderstood you. Not because you were wrong, but because you were early. And in this world, being early is often the same as being rejected. Think of those who came before you. Visionaries. Forerunners. Warriors of light wrapped in fragile flesh. Nikola Tesla envisioned a world of wireless power when others were still struggling with basic electricity. They mocked him. They isolated him. He died poor, alone, ridiculed by those too small-minded to understand the magnitude of his brilliance. And yet now, we live in the world he saw. Our phones, our communication, our modern lives are echoes of his once crazy ideas. Galileo gazed at the heavens and saw truth. He dared to say the earth was not the center of the universe, and for that, they labeled him a heretic. They silenced him. But centuries later, his name is revered, and his heresy is now basic scientific fact. Joan of Arc, a teenage girl, claimed that God had spoken to her and called her to lead an army. For this, she was called a lunatic. She was betrayed by those she served and burned at the stake. Yet now, she is honored as a saint and symbol of divine courage. These are not just stories. These are mirrors. Their lives reflect your own path, not in the details, but in the destiny. You, too, have been misunderstood because your calling is not common. You have been rejected because your spirit does not conform to the mold of this world. You have been labeled as delusional because you have access to a frequency others can't hear. But here's what they don't realize: the gift of sight is not always a blessing in the beginning. When you see what others cannot, you also feel what they're numb to. You cry when others laugh. You tremble when others boast. You feel storms before they appear. You dream of patterns that others will one day study. And you carry burdens in your spirit long before the world names them. They laugh now. But time is on your side. Your madness is just clarity in an unawakened age. And no, you're not imagining it. Those strange feelings, those urges to pull away, to be alone with God, to speak even when your voice shakes, it's all real. The chills you get when truth rises up in your soul. The dreams that replay again and again like prophecy. The way your heart feels heavy around certain people or places, it's not just emotion. It's discernment. It's training. It's evidence of the Spirit moving through you. You're not losing your mind. You're finding your purpose. That still, small voice inside you. That persistent knowing that you're not like everyone else. That quiet fire that keeps burning no matter how many times you try to blow it out. That's not insanity. That's identity. You are a chosen one. Not because you asked to be, but because heaven appointed you. You were born to carry light into places of deep darkness. You were sent to speak truth in a world allergic to it. You were called to live with a heart that breaks for what breaks God's heart, even if that means walking alone. Even if that means people never clap for you, never thank you, never understand you. But you weren't made for their applause. You were made for His approval. The kingdom of God has always moved through misfits. The prophets weren't popular. The apostles weren't mainstream. Jesus Himself was rejected by the very people He came to save. Why? Because light makes people uncomfortable when they've spent their whole lives in the dark. You are light. You carry truth, and truth confronts. It disrupts. It reveals. So of course they try to label it. Of course they try to box you in with words like weird, or obsessed, or unstable. But don't let those labels stick. They're not your identity. They're projections of their own discomfort. God calls you something different. He calls you set apart. He calls you appointed. He calls you beloved. He calls you chosen. You see, there's a kind of wisdom that doesn't need to shout. A kind of knowing that lives in your bones, not your mind. It's what allowed Elijah to hear God not in the earthquake, not in the fire, but in the whisper. And it's that same whisper that speaks to you in the night. That nudges you in prayer. That burns in your chest when you're about to compromise. It's not madness. It's presence. You're not strange. You're sacred. And yes, it hurts. It hurts to be laughed at. It hurts to be the only one in the room who feels the spiritual atmosphere shift. It hurts to be misunderstood by the people you love most. But pain is not proof that you're wrong. Sometimes, it's proof that you're in alignment with heaven, because the enemy always attacks what he fears. If you've been under attack, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, it's not because you're broken. It's because you're a threat. Your voice is a threat. Your obedience is a threat. Your very existence, aligned with God, is a declaration of war against the kingdom of darkness. And make no mistake, the enemy knows who you are, even when the world does not. So keep going. Keep praying. Keep dreaming. Keep declaring the truth, even if your voice shakes. Keep walking in obedience, even if the path is lonely. Keep being light, even if it makes others uncomfortable. You were not created to fit in. You were created to stand out, for the glory of God. You are a spiritual pioneer. A holy outlier. A vessel of revelation, carrying ancient truth into a modern world. And every time they call you crazy, they are unknowingly confirming the power of your assignment. Don't dim your light to make others comfortable in their darkness. Don't water down your discernment just to be accepted. Don't silence the voice of God in you just to blend in. You weren't made to blend. You were made to break patterns. You were made to interrupt cycles. You were made to bring light. So let them stare. Let them gossip. Let them mock. But never forget, they mocked Noah, too, until the rain started. They mocked Joseph, until the famine hit. They mocked Jesus, until the tomb was empty. Their laughter will not outlast your legacy. Your calling is not a coincidence. It is a holy assignment, written into the fabric of your being. And in those quiet moments, when you feel tired, when you feel misunderstood, when you feel like giving up, remember this one truth. You are not lost. You are being led. You are not crazy. You are called. You are not too much. You are more than enough, for the mission God has given you. And when your light shines in places others fear to go, when your discernment speaks what no one wants to hear, when your presence alone disrupts the lies people have built their lives upon, take it as confirmation. You were never meant to be normal. You were meant to be divine. You were meant to carry something eternal in a world addicted to the temporary. And you are doing just that. Now, take a deep breath, and keep walking. Because you are not walking alone. The same Spirit that whispered to Moses, the same fire that burned in Elijah, the same strength that rose in Jesus, it lives in you now. And that makes all the difference. There was a season in your life when being seen felt like a punishment, and being heard felt like rebellion. Every time you opened your mouth to speak what you saw, what you felt in your bones, truths that hadn't yet taken form in the physical world, you were met not with curiosity, but with contempt. You weren't just doubted, you were degraded. People didn't merely disagree with you, they laughed. They labeled you unstable, delusional, irrational. The moment you began to speak the language of revelation, they recoiled. Why? Because your truth disrupted the comfort of their illusion. It threatened the fragile walls of certainty they had built around their limited perception. In their eyes, you were not a seer, you were a disturbance. They called you crazy. Not because you were incoherent, but because you were clear. They mocked your vision. Not because it was faulty, but because it was far ahead. You saw what they couldn't see. You felt what they had numbed themselves to. You named the invisible, and that terrified them. And so, rather than face the discomfort of expanding their understanding, they chose the ease of rejecting you. Ridicule was their refuge. They needed to make you the problem so they didn't have to confront the truth that something in them was missing. Something in them had gone blind. But the thing about truth, real, divine, God-breathed truth, is that it doesn't die under mockery. It doesn't bend beneath laughter. It waits. It grows. It lives. And what once seemed like madness in your mouth now begins to manifest in their world. The warnings you gave, the dreams you described, the spiritual insights you couldn't shake, all of it, piece by piece, is now unfolding. And the ones who once scoffed at you, they have nothing left to say. It doesn't happen with a dramatic apology. Most of them won't come running back with tears and regret. No, what happens instead is far quieter, and far more powerful. It's silence. Their laughter is gone. The smirks have faded. The eyes that once rolled now avert yours. You feel it. You see it. You walk into rooms, and where there was once noise, there is now unease. You sense it in their presence, the tension, the guilt, the internal struggle they're too proud to admit. But you don't need their words anymore. Their silence has said it all. There's a sacred reversal taking place. The emotional energy that once weighed on your shoulders has shifted. It's not because you fought to prove yourself, or demanded validation. You simply endured. You held on to your truth when it cost you everything. You kept speaking it, even if only in whispers to yourself, when no one else could hear it. And now, that truth is undeniable. The world has caught up. And the people who once dismissed you are confronted not by your voice, but by the reality that they now live in. A reality you spoke of long before it arrived. Some will pretend they never doubted you. They'll rewrite the past, convincing themselves they were supportive all along. Others will suddenly become silent followers, watching from a distance, hoping to benefit from what you carry without ever acknowledging how they once treated you. And a few, only a few, might come back sincerely, humbled, ready to listen. But many will remain silent, not because they don't believe you now, but because they're too ashamed to admit they ever didn't. And here's the most powerful part, you no longer need any of it. You no longer crave the apology, the recognition, the vindication. Because truth, when it's from God, has a way of rising above the noise. It confirms itself. It shines without needing spotlights. And the confirmation you're now witnessing isn't about pride, it's about purpose. It's about walking in the knowledge that you were never delusional. You were never foolish. You were never lost. You were chosen. And now, the silence surrounding you is not emptiness, it's evidence. What you're hearing, or not hearing, from the people around you is not coincidence. It's not just a change in tone. It's a shift in spiritual weight. They are speechless because they are convicted. They are quiet because their spirits are unsettled. They are watching you walk in what they mocked, and they don't know how to process that. The mind struggles to accept what the soul already knows. And deep down, they know. They know that the very person they pushed aside is now the one standing in divine alignment. But be careful. This is not the time for bitterness. This is not your moment to rise with an "I told you so" spirit. Your role was never to gloat, it was to carry the mantle. To hold the fire, even when it burned you. To protect the vision, even when it isolated you. And now that the moment has arrived, your power lies not in revenge, but in restraint. Let their silence be. Let it echo in their hearts. Let it do the work you never could with words. Because when silence falls after years of denial, it is louder than any apology. This silence is sacred. It is confirmation. It is closure. But it is also a call. A call to continue forward, to deepen your commitment to the truth that once made you a target. You are not just being proven right, you are being positioned. Not for their validation, but for God's vindication. The silence of your critics is not your goal, it is merely a signpost that you have arrived at the next chapter. One where your truth walks with authority. One where your vision leads others, even those who once opposed it. So don't waste your time waiting for them to speak. Don't exhaust your energy hoping for them to see. If they do, that's grace. If they don't, that's still grace. Because your journey was never about them. It was about obedience. About stewardship. About trusting what God put in you even when it looked like foolishness to everyone else. You were never called to be understood. You were called to be faithful. And now, as you stand in this season of silent confirmation, you must choose what to do with it. Will you shrink to make them comfortable again? Will you dilute your light to help them cope with their shame? Or will you rise, fully, into the calling that once cost you everything? Will you allow their silence to anchor you in humility, while still walking boldly into your destiny? The silence is a gift, but it is also a test. It asks you, can you lead without needing to be applauded? Can you carry truth without craving acknowledgement? Can you move forward without dragging the past behind you? Yes, their silence is proof. But more than that, it is permission. To release. To let go. To bless them in your heart and move on. Not with a sense of superiority, but with sacred surrender. You no longer have to convince anyone. You no longer have to debate, argue, or defend. The fruit is speaking for itself. The truth is no longer in your mouth, it's in your life. And that is enough. Let the silence remain. Let it settle where it needs to. Let it haunt if it must. You have other things to do now. Bigger things. You're no longer trying to survive in rooms that never saw you. You are building sanctuaries for those who do. For those who will. You are planting truth in soil that's ready to receive. And every time you feel the sting of what they once said, remind yourself that their silence now is a song of surrender. You don't need their words. You never did. Because God has already spoken over you. And what He says doesn't need to be echoed to be true. You are not crazy. You are not lost. You were never delusional. You were always chosen. And now, without saying a word, they know it too. There comes a moment, often quiet, almost invisible to others, when everything changes. Not because the world around you suddenly understands, but because something in you no longer needs them to. You've walked through the fire. Not once, but over and over again. And the miracle is not just that you survived, it's that you were refined in it. The laughter, the mockery, the isolation, they were never meant to destroy you. They were sent to test the foundation of your spirit. And what they didn't know is that your foundation wasn't built on approval. It was built on calling. Look at what you've endured. Rejection wasn't just an event, it was a season. A long, bitter season where even those closest to you questioned your sanity, your dreams, your spiritual insights. You shared what you saw, what you felt, what God had whispered into your heart, and you were met with ridicule. They labeled you dramatic, over-spiritual, ungrounded. At times, you almost believed them. The loneliness was unbearable. The silence from heaven felt crushing. You asked God, "Why give me eyes to see, if no one else can understand?" And heaven replied not with explanation, but with endurance. With strength. With stillness. Not because God was absent, but because He was watching to see if you would still believe, even when you stood alone. And you did. Somehow, with trembling hands and tear-filled eyes, you kept going. You stayed faithful to the fire. And now, what was once mocked is being confirmed. What was once dismissed is being revealed. And the most powerful part? You're not even looking for an apology anymore. The need to be validated, to be recognized, to be acknowledged, it has evaporated. You've tasted something deeper. You've touched the hem of divine affirmation. And once heaven calls your name, the applause, or silence, of people becomes irrelevant. They thought the fire would consume you. They waited for the moment you would break, the moment you would give in and admit you were wrong. But instead of crumbling, you emerged sharper, clearer, more refined. The fire didn't kill you, it revealed you. It burned away the need for validation, the desperation for understanding, the hunger for approval. And what was left behind is unshakable. Not because you're perfect, but because you're purified. You are no longer a person seeking permission. You are a vessel carrying purpose. You're not walking around trying to convince people anymore. You're walking in what's already been confirmed in heaven. The opinions of others are just noise now. The truth in you has always been louder, it just needed time to rise. And here's the truth that no one can take from you: you are not crazy. You are chosen. Not in some vague, symbolic way, but deeply, prophetically, intentionally. God placed something inside you that doesn't make sense to the world. And it's not supposed to. If your purpose made sense to everyone else, it wouldn't require faith. If your journey could be explained by logic, it wouldn't be divine. You were set apart. Marked. Called. And yes, that calling isolated you, but only so it could elevate you. You don't need them to say sorry. You don't need them to finally see it. What you needed was already given, the voice of God calling your name through the storm. That was enough. That is still enough. The silence of others is not a void, it is a stage God has cleared for your rising. And as you step into the next chapter, know this: you carry a truth that will not be silenced, because it was born in silence. You carry a fire that will not go out, because it was lit in darkness. You carry a purpose that will not be stopped, because it was forged in rejection. Look behind you. Not with resentment, but with reverence. Every valley, every night spent wondering if you were wrong, every tear shed in secret, was not wasted. Heaven saw it all. Heaven counted each one. And in due season, heaven responded, not by silencing your enemies, but by confirming your anointing. They no longer laugh, not because you demanded respect, but because God established your position. They no longer mock, not because you proved them wrong, but because God proved you right. This is your moment, not to retaliate, but to rise. Not to argue, but to advance. You don't need to shout over the silence. You don't need to revisit old conversations trying to make them see. What needs to be seen is already unfolding. The fruit of your faithfulness is blooming. The vision you carried in secret is now sprouting in the open. The truth you refused to abandon has now become your crown. You are not alone. You are not behind. You are not lost. You are leading now. You are the one others will look to when their own worlds begin to crack. The ones who once called you foolish will seek your wisdom. The ones who said you were too sensitive will seek your discernment. Because deep calls unto deep, and the light you carry cannot be ignored forever. There is an army rising, those who, like you, were once ridiculed for their sight. They are waking up. They are remembering who they are. And they are finding their way back to the voice that called them when no one else did. And when they look up, they will see you. Not because you demanded the spotlight, but because you never let it dim inside you. You became the lighthouse by enduring the storm. So let this be your declaration. I don't need their recognition. I don't need their apology. I don't need their approval. Because God already called my name. And that is enough. He called it when I was alone. He called it when I was misunderstood. He called it when I was walking through fire. And He's still calling it now. I am not rising for revenge. I am rising because I've been refined. I am not moving to prove anything. I am moving because I was made for this. Let those who laughed, remain in their silence. Let those who doubted, wrestle with their conscience. But as for you, walk on. Walk boldly. Walk gracefully. You no longer owe anyone an explanation, only obedience. You don't need the world to clap for you. Heaven already has. And when God claps, mountains move. This is your moment of release. Let go of the past. Let go of the pain. Let go of the need to be seen, to be validated, to be embraced. You are already held, in the hands of the one who chose you before the foundation of the world. You are not defined by the rejection you endured. You are defined by the resilience it birthed. You are not the scars they left behind. You are the sword that was forged because of them. They didn't know who you were then. Now, they don't need to. Because God has already spoken. And His word doesn't return void. You were chosen. You were called. And now, you are commissioned. Not to fight for recognition, but to walk in revelation. So walk, chosen one. Walk without needing to be understood. Walk without waiting for applause. Walk, not because they see you now, but because heaven saw you first. And that will always be enough.